Executive Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. Since 2009, the Kalmanovitz Initiative has been holding convenings like this to discuss the important issues that are affecting workers today. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome you to this discussion. Labor, democracy, and the common good. Where do we stand and what must be done? The purpose of this event is in part to celebrate and discuss a recently published book, which you'll be hearing more about tonight. The Cambridge Handbook of Labor and Democracy, to discuss it with its editors and a few of its more than 24 scholars and activists who contributed to it. In part, this discussion is also about considering the implications for what's discussed in that book for this present moment in which we now find ourselves. Every day seems to remind us anew how much we stand at an inflection point in history. Both our democracy and the workers' movement face grave threats and crises today. And this book gives us a context to discuss where we stand in light of that crisis and what we need to be doing. Tonight, we're very lucky to have secured exactly the right person to lead this discussion. Dorian Warren is co-president of Community Change. He is the co-founder and co-chair of the Economic Security Project and the co-host of the Deep Dive podcast on The Takeaway with Melissa Harris Perry. He taught for over a decade at the University of Chicago and Columbia University, where he was co-director of the Columbia Program on Labor, Law, and Policy. He's the co-author of The Hidden Rules of Race, co-editor of Race and American Political Development, and numerous academic articles. He's been a frequent commentator in the media. And as I've noted before when I've introduced Dorian, every time I have to do this, I'm struck by how many times I have to use the word co in reference to Dorian. Co-president, co-founder, co-chair, co-director, co-author, co-editor. He is one of the great collaborators of our movement and of the folks who care about the kind of issues that we'll be discussing tonight. In fact, I'd say he's the ultimate collaborator, convener, dialogue, thought, and action partner. And he helps all of us be better at articulating what it is we're trying to say and doing what it is we're trying to do. And so when Dorian joins something, he tends to make the whole more than the sum of its parts. So it's my great pleasure to introduce him to get us started tonight. And Dorian, thank you so much for joining us. I kick it over to you.
Thanks so much, Joe. And it takes a lot to make me blush. And that is not the bio we agreed to, but thank you. I'm very honored for those kind words. My job tonight is actually to kind of guide the conversation, but to get out the way and let the editors and the co-authors speak for themselves and speak with each other for this conversation. I'm so pleased. I'm going to do a little show and tell briefly to hold up this book that we're talking about tonight, The Cambridge Handbook of Labor and Democracy, edited by Angela Cornell and Mark Berenberg. And we have a cast of spectacular authors, organizers, activists, scholars in their own right. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then we're going to get right to it. So first is Angela Cornell, who is a clinical law professor at Cornell Law School and founding director of the Labor Law Clinic there, which is committed to providing legal representation that advances freedom of association. Her teaching, practice, and scholarship focus on domestic and international labor law in business and human rights. And before joining the faculty in 2005, she was a partner in a union-side labor and employment firm, and she served as the labor commissioner in the state of New Mexico. So welcome to Angela. Mark Berenberg, my dear old colleague and friend, is the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia University and director of the Columbia Program on Labor Law and Political Economy. His work centers on workers' rights and corporate social responsibility, and he's an expert in the fields of labor and employment law, international labor rights, global economic institutions, constitutional law, and legal political theory. He served as an advisor to the administration of President Barack Obama on issues of labor and trade, and as an independent expert for the International Labor Organization, which is a United Nations agency. And of course, over many, many years, he's worked with many unions and coalitions at both the local and international levels. Welcome to Mark. Sarita Gupta is Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Ford Foundation, overseeing the foundation's domestic work, including civic engagement in government, creativity and free expression, the future of work and workers, technology and society, disability rights, gender, racial, and ethnic justice. She joined Ford to run the Future of Work and Workers project in 2019, after spending 2 decades working to expand people's ability to take collective action to improve their workplaces, communities, and lives. As the longtime director of Jobs with Justice and the founding co-director of Caring Across Generations. And because she does not sleep, apparently, she is the co-author of yet another book that's recently out with Erica Smiley called The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. Lauren Jacobs is the executive director of Power Switch Action, which you probably know as formerly the organization called the Partnership for Working Families. She's been an organizer for over 20 years, where she began organizing factories with Unite in the South, and later joined SEIU, where she served in a number of roles, from organizer to first vice president. Over the course of many, many years, she organized thousands of previously non-union janitors and security officers in 3 major metro areas. She led contract campaigns for tens of thousands of workers, which resulted in breakthroughs in wages and healthcare and other benefits. And before coming to Power Switch Action, Lauren served as the organizing director of the Restaurant Opportunities Center United. Last but not least is Stephen Lerner, who is the Common Good Fellow at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University, where he helps lead the Bargaining for the Common Good Network. Stephen is a veteran of more than 40 years as a labor organizer, and he's worked for an incredibly broad range of unions over the years, most notably SEIU, where Stephen was the architect of the Justice for Janitors campaign. He's been a pioneer of strategies that challenge the ways in which financialization and monopoly power have disempowered workers and undermined traditional collective bargaining strategies. So thank you all for joining us. Let me just make one quick housekeeping announcement, and that is there is going to be an opportunity for questions. I encourage you to put them in the chat at any point during this conversation when you're going to hear from all of our authors. So with that, I want to get first Angela and Mark in the conversation. I'm going to turn to you first, Angela, to briefly tell us the origin story of this book, and essentially why did you edit and write a book on union decline and democracy decline and erosion, particularly on a day like today when it's on lots of our minds. So please talk to us about the origins of this fantastic new book.
Thank you so much, Dorian, and thanks so much for those that put together this book event, as well as the wonderful contributors that are participating this evening. So the book project started in early 2019. We were facing at that time the greatest challenges to democracy in over 80 years, not only the spread of authoritarian regimes around the globe, but the serious encroachments on civil and political rights in the US, of course, under the Trump administration, which you're all aware of. That year, Freedom House documented the retreat of both longstanding democracies as well as newly established democracies. And I'm just going to pull up a couple of slides to, let's see here, give you a little. Let me know if, all right. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Good. So I'm gonna just show you a couple of slides on global patterns of democratization and autocratization. This one is graphic. The red coloration is shows the democracy substantially and significantly in decline over the past decade. So you can see that it's a serious and widespread problem. The next two slides, the first chart shows that the expansion of democracies, because the decline in democracy comes on the heels of 30 years of steady democratic advances in the world during the latter decades of the 20th century. So the blue line that you see shows the expansion of democracies during that period of time. And the next chart, if you look at the red line, you can see the dramatic increase in authoritarian regimes. So countries in every region of the world have taken an authoritarian turn. We've witnessed the revival of authoritarianism, even fascist political currents, including, as you know, in some longstanding democracies. The European think tank IDEA found the number of backsliding democracies, it doubles over the past decades. Despite the international consensus that fundamental labor rights are essential to social justice and political stability, democracy's global retreat has coincided with the erosion of the organization and political strength of labor in much of the world. And so that is really what has driven this book project. The book looks at different dimensions of labor's relationship to democracy, from helping to challenge authoritarian rulers, build democratic regimes, advocating social and economic rights within democracies. So in the context of democratic erosion, it explores whether unions can help safeguard democracy. So the volume provides an analysis of recent patterns of democratic erosion, examining the relationship between political weakening of organized labor in several cases, the political alliances forged by workers in the context of nationalist and political mobilization. We try to take a very broad lens and pull together an interdisciplinary group of scholars to look at the nexus between democracy's erosion and the serious decline of organized labor. So that is really what motivated this book project. As you know, in the US, the union density rate is at its lowest point since even before the National Labor Relations Act was passed at 10.3. So both the declining union density rate and the serious state of democracy in the US and around the globe, those are really what motivated this project.
Thanks, Angela. And so I actually want to get your co-editor and colleague in here, and that's my old colleague and friend, Mark Berenberg. And Mark, I want to ask you to talk to us about what are some of the other big takeaways from the book that you want folks to know, and specifically, what are the big takeaways from the book on the crisis today in the United States? That is, what can we learn from the book about labor and democracy in a time of Trumpism?
Thanks, Dorian. Well, so we're in the midst of a terrible democratic crisis, obviously. And it's the culmination of a decades-long political onslaught against labor unions, and also a decades-long fomenting for political purposes of racial and misogynistic hatreds that do a lot of terrible things. And one of them is to deflect a lot of people from focusing on their class interests. The consequence, Trumpism, is a blatantly anti-democratic political project. So one big takeaway, I'd say, is that the foundation of Trumpism is ruled by the minority. Trumpism is a movement of the minority. So to gain political power, it needs at least two things. It needs government institutions that can be seized by a mere minority. If those institutions don't exist, it has to create them by things like voter suppression and gerrymandering. And second, it has to actively try to discourage or suppress movements like labor movements that operate on the logic of majority rule, right? It's hard to for a minority movement like Trumpism to gain power, hard for it to maintain rule by the minority if it's challenged by a strong mass movement of ordinary people, a labor movement, which is historically what gave us rule by the majority. I'd say a second key takeaway is that Trumpism aspires to rule by the minority in all three branches of government and at both the federal and state levels. And both the crisis of labor movement and the crisis of democracy are connected to minority rule in all those branches and levels. So the legislature, minority rule is possible in Congress and state legislatures because of the erosion of labor, yes, but also because of our perverse anti-majoritarian constitutional rules and because of the perennial power of finance capital over the legislature. The minority then entrenches itself by passing legislation that suppresses the right to vote, that gerrymanders, and that attacks unions and blocks any new labor legislation that might protect union organizing and striking, even though a big majority of workers and voters think unions are a good thing. And we can expect even worse if we get a future Congress that's controlled by MAGA Republicans who are even more zealous and homogeneous than they were in the last administration. And then in the executive branch, right, we saw a right-wing president also elected by a minority of the people because of our anti-majoritarian constitution, who extinguished the rights of federal government workers, who appointed labor board officials that cut a swath through the rights of private sector workers, and so on. If union density had been just a little greater in swing states in 2016, then Trump would not have seized his minority power. And the present moment would look so much different. Again, minority rulers are threatened by mass movements that operate on the logic of majoritarianism. The third branch, the courts. So the Supreme Court today is an ally of minority government, and it was installed by those very minority elected politicians. And no one needs reminding this week that the court's pursuing a radical anti-democratic project, crushing women's rights, labor rights, voting rights, disempowering the agencies that enforce the rights of ordinary folks, unleashing corporate money for political contributions, and on and on. So you can't overemphasize how urgent it is to rebuild a powerful worker movement that could drive a return to majority rule, something that's so basic to democracy. And, you know, the upcoming speakers are going to talk about the new kind of labor movement we need in our time. But I guess that points to a third big takeaway from the book about the current situation. And maybe this takeaway is kind of a grab bag. The book lays out a lot of big economic and political developments, in addition to Trumpism itself, that account for why our time is different and why our time calls for a new kind of labor movement. And some of these big developments, I think, change the way workplace life interacts with community life outside the workplace. So those developments might be especially relevant for the topic of this conference. And I guess I have time to just mention a couple. You can learn the rest by spending a cozy, lighthearted weekend with the book. So there are a lot of big changes in economic patterns that are relevant, obviously. For example, you know, the increased fragmentation of employment and degradation of work in the age of outsourcing, supply chains, network production. And at the same time, there's new concentration of power in finance and the big digital platforms and other sectors. So workers' power is weakened by both fragmentation and concentration that we're seeing. So workers have to reach outside the workplace if they want to take on these external forces of production networks and financial institutions. A second development, background development, there are a slew of trends that have increased the monthly bills that individual households have to pay. Households now have to pay more for certain basic goods that used to be provided as public goods by collective actors like governments and unions. expenses for things like retirement security and public college tuition. And at the same time, the prices of basic private goods like rental housing have increased faster than wages. And household budgets and local government budgets have taken another hit from predatory finance when they go into the market for credit. So these things impose additional financial burdens on workers' lives outside the workplace. But one theme of the book is that those household burdens also directly weaken workers' bargaining power in the workplace, right? If individual households themselves have to pay more to survive, then the pressure to take or keep a job, an exploitative job, is greater, and the more perilous it is to risk losing the job by making trouble on the job, flexing power. So workers have a direct interest in all forms of collective provision and private consumption across the range of community and household needs outside the workplace. One final example, there have been radical changes in communication networks. You all know how social media promoted Trumpism. Demagogues like Trump use Twitter or other social media so they can directly reach individual workers who aren't organized. Unions, by contrast, are centers of non-hateful political communication and education in worker communities, in group discussion, rather than one-way communication from the demagogue directly to the individual. So taken together, the decline in union density and the rise of social media give us a public sphere that's poisoned by anti-democratic communication. So it's vital then, again, looking outside the workplace, to change the commercial model of social media we now have to non-commercial platforms supported by communities and by worker organizations, if we can do that. Okay, so to wrap up, as I said, these developments, a lot of others, seem to make for new interactions between workplace life in the community outside the workplace. So I leave it to the upcoming speakers who know something about that to instruct us optimistically about the opportunities coming out of those or other big developments. I've emphasized the setbacks to democracy and the labor movement from the political and economic forces I've been describing. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Mark. And I thank you to both Angela and Mark, because I just want to make this quick point and then get to what's the path forward with our next four speakers. But one of the most important things I took away from the book was the relationship between union decline and democracy erosion. There has been so much scholarship that talks about the democratization of countries and the relationship of the labor movement. I think I learned this in grad school. Without a strong labor movement, you have no democracy. But we often thought of it as you needed a labor movement for democratization. And you both have actually really, really convincingly, and with lots of chapters in this book, I'm going to turn to one in 1 second, really shown the relationship between the lack of workers' rights, the lack of unionization, and the erosion and decline of democracy, which is very sobering in this moment in which I think we all find ourselves. So how to get out of this, this dilemma we're in, and what both Angela and Mark just laid out so clearly. So there's an important chapter in the book, and I heard Mark, before many of you joined, say the most important chapter in the book, which is called The Lever and the Fulcrum, Organizing and Bargaining for Democracy. I love that that's the first thing, organizing and bargaining for democracy and the common good. And so our next four speakers are the co-authors of that chapter. And I want to turn to our dear friend Sarita Gupta first to talk about a little bit about this chapter, but she also plays a really important role at the Ford Foundation. And Sarita, I want to ask you, given your current role, given you have a very wide landscape view of the connections between labor and democracy, talk to us a bit about what you're seeing, what kinds of collaborations and approaches and partnerships you're supporting to reverse the erosion of both worker power and democracy. And by the way, in her intro, you heard me say she is the co-founder of Caring Across Generations and many other of these collaborations. So talk to us from not just your perch at the Ford Foundation, but actually being at the heart of the struggle for this new path forward for the labor movement.
Great, thanks so much, Dorian. So I guess before I dive into the new approaches, I do want to do a little bit of a bird's eye view and just say from my perch at Ford, as both Mark and Angela laid out, both worker bargaining power and political democracy have been gripped by a mutually reinforcing crisis that's worsened for decades, harming workers and undermining our social fabric. We're experiencing exploding wealth and income inequality, resurgent monopoly, judicial attacks on unions, the rise of white supremacy, voter suppression, and state violence that's targeted at communities of color. And these all demonstrate the crises of politics and of worker organization, and frankly, clarify the relation between the two. Therefore, it's going to be really critical for us to link the defense of political democracy to the fight for bargaining power for workers in the 21st century economy. So much of the voter suppression and anti-union tactics that we see by employers are attempts, as Mark said, to solidify mass inequality in the economic arena and minority rule in the political arena. So at Ford, we're paying attention to the combination of recent actions and trends that point to the need to strengthen our democracy. And I just want to point out 5 trends and then pivot to what we're supporting. So the 5 trends of concern are, the first trend is, of course, the rollback of Roe, the Voting Rights Act, and protections for trans people are all parallel affronts to participation and representation of people in our democracy. And at the same time, looking at voting rights alone, the backlash to record voter turnout in 2020 was swift and fierce as 19 states passed 34 laws restricting access to voting in 2021. And this trend has continued in 2022. And there's hundreds of bills with restrictive provisions today in states. So at the same time that practices of voter suppression are being reinstitutionalized, workers are experiencing a growing sense of authoritarianism in their workplace. So work is a place where freedom of speech, assembly, association are relentlessly curbed, where people are subject to surveillance of their movements and communications by new technologies, where non-compete agreements, signed as a condition of employment curtail the right of workers to leave their jobs and seek better ones, and where arbitration clauses strip them of their right to legal recourse when they have suffered discrimination, harassment, health, or safety violations. So that's a big, huge trend we're paying attention to. The second is the ineffectiveness of civil rights protections for Black, Brown, and immigrant residents, which further limits the participation of these communities in our political, our economic, and our cultural systems. And we know that those of us who are working to strengthen democracy are doing so in the face of exponential disinformation, the real threat of political violence, and attempts to, by some to hardwire minority rule. Third, there's a growing credible fear of significant political violence, which also creates barriers for engagement in our democracy. So this is both in workplaces and broadly in our political democracy. And in fact, experts warn that the 2022 midterm elections will be a marker as to where the US is on the potential decline from a participatory democracy towards authoritarianism. And then fourth, a pervasive belief that government does not work has been prevailing for decades, that's fostering the lack of faith in public institutions. And then fifth, recognizing the defenders of democracy cannot depend on the courts and Congress, as we very much are feeling this week in particular. Look, workers have long known they can't count on the NLRB, or the legal frameworks are outdated. There's no updated reforms to labor laws or other protections. And we should be clear that this conservative Supreme Court will be looking to eliminate rights that are not explicitly written in the Constitution, as they already did with Janus, right? So this is what we're facing, which requires us really to build a new type of labor movement. one in which we're very explicitly clear that bargaining power is central to democracy, where we are in fact helping to support and grow new frameworks and organizing models that really get at fundamentally speak to the impacts of globalization and financialization of our economy and the fissuring of our economy, if you will, on workers. So how we take campaigns to really get to the ultimate profiteers, or the common good campaigns, or the community-based bargaining campaigns. And I won't go into details because I know Stephen will speak to some of this and Lauren will speak to some of this. But then the third piece of how we build the kind of labor movement we need is one that truly centers race and gender, and not from a perspective of we're allies in the work together, but because we understand the complex identities of workers themselves in the 21st century, but also because it's fundamentally about power. We will not win if we don't center race and gender in the kind of organizing that we do. So given this, at Ford, we're doing a ton of supportive organizations. I feel actually nervous and worried about our future, but also very hopeful when I look at the kind of organizing that is taking root, and organizing that really chooses to take a values-based approach versus issue silos. And I think that's a really important thing to lift up. I think for a long time, the worker movement, the labor movement, has gotten stuck in conversations about issues or process of why we need bargaining, like how we get to bargaining through the legal process and frameworks, and not enough about what the end goal is. That fundamentally we want workers to be able to live with dignity, with agency, with voice, with respect, and how we build those kinds of values-based approaches and campaigns. So when we look at efforts like bargaining for the common good, which you'll hear more about in a moment, those are the types of frameworks that I think point to the new labor movement that we need, or the work that Lauren is doing through Power Switch Action, which she will talk more about. Networks like my former organization, Jobs with Justice, that really are supporting grassroots efforts to really expand notions of bargaining. Organization like campaign organizations like Athena Coalition and Caring Across Generations. Athena Coalition as an entity that's really paying attention to monopoly power in our society and the ways in which a massive entity like Amazon cannot be won just by having a labor frame, but we need a really multifaceted frame and strategy of how we actually hold corporations like Amazon accountable. Or Caring Across Generations, where you literally center the issue of workers and worker power within a broader social context, so that you can and have a real intersectional approach of placing the most vulnerable domestic workers who don't have labor rights in this country, women of color, immigrants, right in the center of a strategy that will benefit everyone across our society when it comes to care policies and care needs. And finally, organizing groups across the country, worker centers who've long been working at these intersections, like domestic workers, like United for Respect, like SETUL in Minnesota, Workers' Defense Project in Texas. Like, there's so many lovely and amazing examples and powerful examples of groups working on this. And then the last thing I'll say is just that I think we're in a moment when it's important, and I certainly feel like it's important to be organizing philanthropic resources in the right way to support the growth of a new labor movement. And so at Ford, we're helping to seed the Southern Workers Opportunity Fund in the South. And the goal is to bring together not only social justice philanthropy, or philanthropy that cares about workers, but leverage those resources with those of unions, so that the labor movement and philanthropy together are figuring out, how do we resource for the long term in the South? And how do we really resource efforts that sit at this deep intersection of political and economic democracy? And then, of course, support ongoing movement building efforts. So those are the kinds of things that at Ford I'm paying attention to, the types of things I'm trying to support. But all of it requires, I think in this moment, a real clarity. There's in a moment where we see a ton of really great organizing happening and work, like the uptick of worker organizing, it's really easy for the narrative to be, oh, that's cool and it's decentralized and people are just doing things, versus understanding that there are actually core strategies that are being tested and tried that undergird what we're seeing today, that there's actually a need for that kind of diligence and clarity of the values and the new narratives that we're trying to craft, because we're never going to win on this issue of labor and democracy if we don't fundamentally shift how our society and culture values labor and values workers and understands the critical role of the labor movement and worker power in our democracy. So much more to say on that, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Sarita. And as you could just hear, Sarita's she's not a philanthropy, she's an organizer's organizer. She's a worker organizer who happens to work in philanthropy. And we are very, very lucky to have you where you are. So thank you. Lauren, I'm gonna turn to you next, because I've heard you say many, many times, you've tossed out the word authoritarianism, totalitarianism at work and in private corporations. I know you think about this. This is part of your daily work. So talk to us about what's both important and striking about this chapter that you've co-written, about this conversation thus far, in terms of the authoritarian threat to our democracy writ large. So talk to us about the connection between democracy at the workplace and political democracy.
Great, thank you, Dorian. And I'm so excited to, what a treat to get to work with Steve and Joe and Sarita on a chapter and to, drink in their brilliance. And I'm just loving this conversation. And thank you to Mark and Angela for pulling together all these amazing authors. Yes, I think we have to consider that we are sitting in a moment fighting for democracy writ large in society, where most of our fellow citizens spend most of their days inside dictatorships. There's no freedom of speech in the workplace. There's no freedom of assembly. There's no freedom of association. In fact, in sort of an Amazon warehouse, people are tagged with little monitoring devices that are tracking not only how long they stop and turn and talk to a coworker, but how long they even spend in the bathroom. The right to even access laws, which allegedly, as members of the society should be able to access the ability to sue their employer or to take action against their employer. This is in the absence of the union. If a violation happens, is being severely curtailed by the widespread use of these binding arbitration agreements, which basically railroad workers into what is basically a kangaroo court. It's an arena completely controlled by the boss. And so I think we have to, if we're saying that democracy is a muscle and it is a practice, we have to think about what is being atrophied if we leave the 8, the 10, the 12 hours that people are spending of their daily lives in an arena where they are accepting, I don't have a voice, I don't participate in anything, I get told what to do, I even get told how long I can eat and how long I can go take care of my personal needs, or whether I can talk to somebody at my workplace, or what I can talk to about at my workplace. And so I think in that context, the critical need for mass scale workplace organizing becomes obvious and undeniable. And I do want to speak about this as an organizer, and just like an organizer that's going out to a shop and seeing the transformation that happens in people when they have an organization that is theirs, and when the workplace transforms in a way through their own doing. It's addictive. Agency is addictive. It's something that it changes you. I think for any of us that have been in these moments, you can see physical change in how people carry themselves and walk in a moment where they've achieved a victory, where they have bested the boss. And I think it becomes clear why we have to scale this in much faster fashion. But I do also want to say it's not enough on its own. Yes, organizing unions in the workplace, worker centers, whatever tools we have to gain voice and power for workers, we need to be deploying whatever ways that we can transform that people have voice and agency in their workplace, we need to do. But it's not enough if we just stop at wages, benefits, and working conditions. We need to be also thinking about our role as that we are building up our fellow citizens to be full participants in democracy and society. That whole point about being addictive, I think we see this in how when we have high labor density in certain areas, in a geography, electoral participation increases. And we can see that. We can see that sometimes when I have over the years being a labor organizer, have gone to a community organization, and guess what? Oh, there's one of our stewards that's involved with the tenants union. Again, it's a different way of agency was learned in one place, and so it moves to other places. And I think in this moment of the mega corporation, this becomes even more critical because it's not just the workplace where folks are being oppressed or having their voice and rights taken from. We're seeing with companies that are playing in a number of places that it's not only at work, it's then who owns the mortgage, who owns the apartment building, who's the grocery store in the neighborhood, where is it situated? It's who's now got the private contract to run the metro system, the transportation system in the region in which people live. So I want to, just sort of conclude with the point of saying, and this is why Power Switch Action has this analysis, that at root, all roads point to corporate power, and that we have to best it, both at the workplace, but also in the other forms in society by taking this on. And I do think the root of that is how do we organize folks to take power at work and build collective power, but they'll also support folks in their leadership and the development of their capacities. So they then go on to organize in all the sectors and areas of society that are in need of transformation.
Thank you, Lauren. You said so much there, but I want to say two things as we pivot to the next speaker. Agency is addictive. I think everybody's going to walk away with that tonight. Agency is addictive, 100%. And then you said, and this is my way of pivoting to you, Stephen Lerner. You said, we can't stop at wages, benefits, and working conditions. And so, Stephen, you have been working on a very visionary project for, I think, over a decade now with your collaborators here called Bargaining for the Common Good. And it is about more than wages, benefits, and working conditions. So talk to us about Bargaining for the Common Good. Can you give us an example or two that was in the chapter of some very successful and inspiring fights and campaigns that connect the workplace to community?
Yes, I can do that. But before I do that, I just want to take a second to say, I've been in a pretty terrible mood lately because it is, we've referenced it, but we do feel like we're sleepwalking into whatever you want to call it, fascism, authoritarianism. And what I'm really enjoying about this call is people are asking this, whatever we call this Zoom, are asking the right and the biggest questions about what's going on. And I just think it's incredibly important that we give ourselves the space to both talk how bad it is and have urgency out of that, but then to realize there are pathways forwards. And that's what I'm hearing out of this, that, both Mark and Angela really laid out, this is global. Sarita and Lauren were brilliant in talking about both what we need to do and some of the obstacles. And so in many ways, Bargaining for Common Good was built for this moment. And I'd start with that Bargaining for Common Good, it's not necessarily new. As Joe may talk about later, we're taking what people have done for 100 years and stopped doing and trying to reintroduce it. And the first thing I'd say about Bargaining for Common Good is that we're striving to get people to a common analysis about how racialized capitalism works in America. And I won't repeat everything that Sarita and Lauren said, but they were really hitting on something specific. It's not just that the system isn't working, but who is most damaged by that. So the first thing we say in Bargaining for Common Good is we need to get people to a common analysis about what's happening in capitalism. And that leads us to have sort of 5 core principles. And then about Bargaining for Common Good that you've already heard from Sarita and Lauren, but I'll list them and then I'll get into specifics. One is that we have to center racial justice. And some of these are so obvious, I'm not going to have to explain why, but that's core to every Bargaining for Common Good campaign. Second is that we need to expand the scope of what we're fighting for beyond wages and benefits. Third, we need to engage community allies as real partners in developing issues, not as a transactional relationship, not, can I rent a collar, but how do we identify issues that matter to community members and workers? And with the core thing being that Lauren got to is that the labor movement, when I started as an organizer, people told me all that mattered was what happened between the four walls of the factory, as if that's all that mattered in our lives. And what Bargaining for Common Good is built on is the idea that workers have full lives. They have a work life, they have neighborhoods, they have schools. And how do you capture all of that in what we're fighting for? That we need to rebuild our organizations from the bottom up in terms of going deep and people understanding a deeper analysis. And we have to expose the giant corporations and bad actors that are really driving things. That it's not natural, it's not the evolution of society that 10 people are worth more money than almost the whole country. So if you think about it, what's happened over the last, I don't know, Mark or somebody can tell me how many years, is employers and the government have worked to limit what workers can bargain around, just to wages and benefits. And then they turn around and they say, oh, isn't the union greedy? All they care about is themselves. All they do is bargain about wages and benefits. So the idea behind Bargaining for Common Good is how do we connect the full lives of workers and communities and unions and use that bargaining moment when everybody's watching the union and everybody's watching the bargaining to raise the biggest kind of issues, to politicize bargaining, to make bargaining not just about can I get a raise, but about co-governance of work, about co-governance of our community, that it's a grand democratization project, might be one way to describe it. And I could go on and on about the different pieces and the different kind of demands, but maybe the best way to do this is give some specific examples. Dorian, some may not be in the book because they're newer. But one example I think some of you all may know is when the Chicago teachers went on strike, one of the core issues was homeless students. There's 20 to 40,000 homeless students in Chicago. And they struck over demand, and I won't go through all the demands, about the role the city could play and the school could play in helping to house students and what the support they need. But what was important about this is, one, it's right. More testing won't help homeless students learn. They need homes. But second, it built a connection between the community and between other leaders and the union that was so deep that when the mayor of Chicago basically ran a slate against the Chicago Teachers Union to try to take out the leadership, that they had overwhelming support. So again, they took an issue that mattered to their members, they took an issue that mattered to the community, and they bargained over it. They didn't get all of it, but they got some of it. And it was a huge stride forward. In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, Local 26, the janitors local, had a strike over, one of the first strike over climate demands that they struck because they realized that 73% of greenhouse office emissions in Minnesota come out of office buildings. So they had this brilliant idea, which is, one, how do they raise that issue? Second, how would it benefit workers? So they proposed that workers should be trained and have upgrades on how you take on emissions. And then they had actually the student climate strikers come to the bargaining table with them and witness the process. And when they went on strike, they struck with student climate strikers, building a deep, deep alignment. And the part that moved me most about it was some obnoxious reporter said to one of the workers, well, why do you care about climate? And she I think she was from Honduras. She said, I had to leave my country and come to the US because our climate was so degraded that we couldn't farm anymore. So again, we didn't narrow it to can we get a little bit more money, but we raised the biggest issues and workers leapt at it. They didn't laugh at it, they leapt. They were excited. And so when Lauren talks about agency, all of a sudden janitors who are invisible are leading a strike with community partners around the climate. And a third example that's, I guess we'll call organizing for common good, is what the UAW is doing right now, which is there's a massive transition to electric vehicles. And to be honest, we all know that the UAW for many years was like resistant to that. But now with this massive transition, they've launched a giant campaign to reorganize the entire auto industry, which is now majority non-union. And the three core planks of that are A, zero emissions. We have to save the planet, something auto workers get. The second plank of it is obviously workers' rights, that all these companies that are getting massive subsidies should not from the government, should not simultaneously fight the union. And the third is racial justice. The industry is relocated to the South. 40% of the workers in the South are people of color. And surprise, surprise, when they go to the South, they want to pay less, et cetera, et cetera. So the union is now working deeply, incredibly deeply with environmentalists who are 100% behind them, who are now going to companies and saying, you are not a green company if you don't respect workers' rights and you don't deal with racial justice. So we've pushed together all those issues, not because we're nice people, but because that's the power you need to win. And winning means not just organizing the auto plants in Tennessee, but how do we do that so we fundamentally challenge the Southern economic model of low wages, heavy subsidies, no public services. So when we talk to workers, we talk about not only are you screwed because you don't make enough money, but your kids have lousy schools because all the money went to subsidize the auto companies. So I know I'm probably over time, so I can't go through all of it. But to me, this really goes to what I think Sarita and Lauren were really trying to hit. And I want to challenge you maybe, Mark, a little bit when you said if union density had been a little higher. I think we have a tremendous danger here that many people are so excited about the union, they think we can recreate the labor movement of the 60s. And if we just had more members and we just had more density, what we really need to talk about is what Lauren and Sarita said. How do we have a new kind of labor movement that is about all the things that we've talked about, that's about transforming society and transforming workers' lives? And what I'd end with is, I think I've got so many historians, I'm afraid to say this, but I think my memory is correct that the three countries that had dramatic increase in the labor movement in the last century were South Korea, Brazil, and South Africa. And all three of those countries, the labor movement was aligned with the democracy movement and the anti-authoritarian movements. And when the dictatorships fell, they had massive growth because everybody saw that the union was not just about getting a little bit more money, the union was about making the world a decent place. And so bargaining for common good is about how do we unite labor and community and build out giant campaigns that both organize unions, but organize unions that transform and partner with the community. And I'll give you the final example. When the teachers in Los Angeles, they don't just do worker bargaining demands anymore, they do a community bargaining survey to say, what do we want in our contract to benefit students and communities? And one of the things they negotiated was green spaces. So let me just end there and say, I see bargaining for common good as a vehicle to try to accomplish what Lauren, Sarita, and everybody else was saying.
Thank you, Stephen. And since you put Mark on the spot, I'm going to ask Mark and our other co-panelists to get ready to engage. But I actually want to bring in our resident historian on something you just said, Stephen, because I'm going to pick a bone with you. You listed off three countries, South Africa, South Korea, and Brazil, and you failed to mention the United States. And I think there is an argument to be made that when there was an increase in worker power, first under Reconstruction, that was our first, you could argue that's the first democratic moment or close to democratic moment. The second democratic moment of the second Reconstruction, as Reverend Barber says, is the 1960s. And you can argue that that came about because of the UAW and because of the Organization of Industrial Workers and CIO unions. And that actually had a relationship, which some of you say in the chapter, to the rise of public sector workers and unions in the 60s. So I think you got to add the US to that because we actually really just became a democracy in 1965 by some measures. But I want to actually ask the historian here, Joe McCartin, to help us make sense of everything we've just heard from the long sweep of history and what lessons might we take away from what we've heard in terms of both the darkness and the light when it comes to worker power throughout our long history.
Oh, thank you, Dorian. It's a big task. Let me just try to do it by going first to the title of our book, which I'm glad that you called out to people. We call it The Lever and the Fulcrum for a reason. We wanted to create an idea that democracy and worker organization and power are as interdependent as a tool, as a lever and a fulcrum. One doesn't work without the other. And in the long sweep of US history, Dorian, as you were just noting, we see multiple iterations of how those two things work together to really move a country forward. The first one you cite, Reconstruction, as Black labor becomes free. And we have the constitutional amendments. There's a sudden expansion of democracy. We know that doesn't last. It gets violently repressed. Then there are 3 moments in the 20th century where you could see the lever and the fulcrum again, like playing off each other to push things forward. One of those, I think, is in World War I, when the country really needed labor support. And workers used the leverage of that to make demands, both in the workplace against the autocracy of that time. And as Lauren talks about people being in an autocracy today in the workplace, in the World War I years, workers began to talk about, my boss is an autocrat, like the Kaiser that we're supposed to be fighting. And so they were able to like bring those things together. And I think that helped open the door to the democratic expansion of women's suffrage in the 30s and World War II. The New Deal and the war is a second moment in the 20th century where you see these things working together as industrial unions grow. It's out of that struggle that you begin to see the first evidence of the falling of the structures that were put in place to deny Black suffrage. Smith versus Albright is 1944, and it begins a long effort to attack the disfranchisement of African Americans. And it comes out of this fulcrum of labor organization interacting with this democratic demand. And then the third is the one you pointed to, the expansion of the public sector movement coinciding with the civil rights struggle. So you had these things working in tandem over history. It seems to me, and I learned so much from working with my organizer colleagues here, they helped me to see history in a new and clearer way. That looking back now, it seems to me that between, say, 1968 and the early 80s and what sometimes historians call the long 70s, that a switch got flipped. What I think of is if people are old enough to remember how you used to jack up a car and you would use your tire iron to like crank it up and it would ratchet up. And then when you were done changing it, you flip a switch and you do the same motion, but that brings it down. And in a sense, it seems like a switch got flipped in those years in the US where the interaction went the other way, in which attacks on labor opened up attacks on real democracy, and the erosion of democracy made labor more vulnerable. And we've been living through an era of that. So what's the takeaway for us now? I think if you look back in those earlier periods, Reconstruction right after the Civil War, World War I, the 30s and the World War II, and then the 50s and 60s, they were all eras in which there was a larger crisis that helped to create an environment where workers could maximize their power. In each of those cases, really the backdrop of a war or depression was important. And so I think one thing is that moments of crisis can also be moments of opportunity, and that we've seen in the past. But to make the moments of opportunity, what you needed in each of those settings, I think, were ideas and forms of organization that helped maximize the leverage workers could bring to bear in these crises. And the 30s brought that about with industrial unionism. The public sector movement brought that about in the 50s and 60s. And I think what Stephen is talking about with bargaining for the common good is one form of organization that can maximize worker power and leverage in the current crisis that we face. And like Stephen, I'm optimistic. There are plenty of things that, are enormous challenges today. But looking at the past gives me a lot of hope. And looking at the things that are happening right now that Stephen was just talking about, and that Sarita alluded to earlier, gives me a lot of hope that we can, in this moment, bring these two essential forces into alignment again and produce a breakthrough. Nobody anticipated the breakthrough of the 30s before it happened. The leading economist of the time in 1932, studying labor, he predicted by the end of the 30s there would be no labor movement. So we've been in periods like this before. I think there's a lot of reason to believe we can turn this around and flip that switch again the other way, so that we can begin to expand both worker power and democracy. They have to work hand in hand.
Thank you, Joe. Very, very helpful and sweeping history there in a short amount of time. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes and give our co-panelists the chance to respond to anything they may have heard, they may have disagreed with, they maybe want to elaborate on. So we have just a few minutes if any one of you want to jump back into the conversation. I see you coming off mute, Mark, and then Angela, and then I'll take the others.
Well, I'll just respond to what Stephen, sorry, about my comments about union density. I'm entirely convinced that the most compelling vision and strategy for worker empowerment, social empowerment, political empowerment, and democratization from the bottom up is the bargaining for the common good vision and strategy. I think, so by all means, the number of members, dues paying members, is not the be all and end all. I was using it as a proxy. And my point was simply that incremental enlargement of power could have changed things radically. And so I'll withdraw happily dues paying membership as the best proxy for the kind of empowerment, democracy enhancing empowerment, flourishing, human flourishing, and the most appealing response to racialized capitalism. It's much more complex. It's qualitative in the ways that all of you co-authors on that chapter conveyed so well in the chapter, and then here as well. So I'm sorry if I misled the audience out there.
I just need to say, Mark, you're completely right. Density is important. I was just using to make a point that I've been to so many union meetings where people say, if we just had more members, and the point being, if we just had members as part of a bigger plan, not just numbers. But so I was just using you as a way to make a point. I withdraw my comment in the spirit of camaraderie debate.
Can I also just make a really quick point on this? Actually, it's related because there is something, and I want to point out one of the other great chapters. I can't resist, Angela and Mark, in the book by Jake Brumbach, Paul Freimer, and Tom Gorzelik, which shows the relationship between unions and racial justice. And the one punchline you can take away is that if you have two working class white men and you put one in the evangelical church, you put one in a union, they're going to come out very differently in terms of their attitudes and behaviors around racial justice. And so the numbers actually does matter. If there's been a sharp decline in unionization and the number of white workers in unions the last 50 years, and here we are in this moment right now in terms of the politics of race and racial injustice, I think there's something going on there. So Angela, I know you want to get back in.
Yes, thanks for making that point. I was simply going to say that the book really does try to pull together some analysis of the unique role that unions play in society, and at so many different levels. And one level is race. We see around the globe the way in which populists or authoritarians are able to pull in the white working class. And we know that unions actually play, because of social science research, we know that unions play an important role in being able to resist. For white union members are less likely to support right-wing populists around the globe. And we also know union members were less likely to support Trump. And so the way in which union members of different races and national origins, et cetera, political positions working together can really build solidarity and cross important bridges. So I just wanted to make that point, as well as the way in which unions help to counterbalance the ferocious neoliberalism that undermines society. There's so many, at so many different levels, unions play a unique force in society, and the book really tries to pull in that analysis. So that was just my only point. Thanks.
Thanks, Angela. I'm going to call on both Lauren and Sarita to get back in, and then I'm going to go to questions from you in the chat. Thank you already to the three of you who I think we all know, Amy and Maritza and Nell. So I'll come to your questions next, but Lauren and Sarita.
Yeah, I think very quickly, this is a great discussion on this, particular question on like, is the numbers, how do people relate within the union? I wanted to also talk about the other reason why we need to do this, or why it's important, is also that it's not like the corporation's content to have its little dictatorship inside and steamroll people inside of its workplaces and they'll leave the rest of us alone. The other thing we're seeing is sort of the way that they see the world is expanding into how governance or government functions. State, what we've been calling corporate state interference, but people know as state preemption, is one iteration of this, where like a state government says, no, city, you can't raise the minimum wage, no paid sick days, no climate laws. Normally, when you track that back, that is completely corporate driven agenda on deregulating whole sectors of the economy. So I think this is also like why both, attacking corporate power, both in the workplace and outside, becomes critical. The other note I just wanted to make about, I think to Angela's point on organizing, and I just thought that was really wise, and Dorian, your point about how people are transformed, I think that's right. I also think there's a way in which people become maybe not feminist in their own heads, but feminist in action. Like if you go to a union meeting, you will see people like, let me hold the baby. Why don't you take a rest? Go sit down, right? There's just a way in which folks' sense of care, they're around each other for 8-10 hours a day normally, but like the organization, the union creates a vehicle to be much more involved in people's lives. I know this sounds very micro and small, but I do think it has a macro effect and how people then start to consider other issues in society at large.
Thanks, Lauren. Sarita.
Yeah, there's so many threads now, so I'm going to try to be really brief because I know we want to get to the questions. But, this is more just I guess it's something I'm trying to puzzle through myself. And I was just struck by, Angela, the comments you were just making about the unique role of unions, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I mean, they are the schools of democracy. There's a reason why they've been referred that way. And for all the reasons you just said, and even Lauren, the point you just made, that is really important, that people truly are transformed. But they are schools of democracy because they are places where people practice democracy. And we've really lost the daily habit of like the practice of democracy in our society. And I just worry a lot about, as we see sort of, growing polarization in our country and huge swaths of our places in the country where unions actually don't exist, where and how the labor movement can, in its new form, when I think about the new labor movement, so traditional unions alongside some of the new organizing that we're seeing in this moment, how we harness this moment the right way when we come to that. And I'm speaking specifically like about a month ago, I was at the University of Oregon. I had the privilege of getting to spend 4 weeks out there. And it's the first time in my career that I went onto a college campus, into a classroom and said, when I say labor or unions, what do you think of? And it was the first time I did not hear every negative stereotype. It was the first time people were like, Starbucks, Amazon, oh my God, like Apple workers, Google workers. I mean, people like young people are thinking about organizing in a serious way. They're thinking about worker power differently. And it's so exciting. We have a responsibility though. There's a cultural opening right now, but unfortunately, not enough unions are actually meeting this moment. And this gets to some of the questions that actually, like Maritza's question about what do we do with this conversation about decentralized or independent unions that are being built? And are they able to actually win against massive consolidation of corporate power in the way that we see happening? I mean, this is a big conversation around ALU right now. Like, will they get to a first contract? What is possible? So I just want to name it because I am really optimistic. I am an optimistic person. I really believe there's a lot to be done. But what we haven't talked about is how we have to actually shift the institutions and the new institutions we're building, the new organizing we're building, what forms. And I'm curious from Stephen and Joe, from your experience with BCG, what kinds of transformations you may be seeing in institutions that actually allow for the kind of organizing you're talking about, or how we're grappling with these questions of independent unions in a moment of mass concentration of wealth and power.
So let's put that question on the table. Thank you, Sarita. And I'm going to add a few others and give our panelists a chance to respond. So first from Amy, who said, thanks for these amazing presentations. Didn't think anyone could make me feel optimistic this week. Stephen and Lauren touched on this, but just to highlight it more, given the greater union density in the public sector and the urgency of public services to improve the lives of working class and poor people, can you speak to the confluence between labor and tax justice? I know it's a tough week to defend government. Nonetheless, public austerity devalues the lives of working people, and more robust public budgets feel essential to the fight you're waging. Question one. Question two from Maritza. I wonder if there are any reactions to the new organizing efforts taking place that are building more independent unions instead of building current institutions. From Nell, I'm really not an electorally oriented person, but how do you see bargaining for the common good style work, strengthening progressive electoral coalitions in both practice and theory? And then last but not least from Mark, many unions don't practice democracy. Does that change the analysis here? Bargaining for the common good, yes, but what about struggles for what used to be called industrial democracy, practicing democracy in the workplace? And Karen, just at the last minute, put in a question, which we'll read in the meantime, but I want to give our panelists a chance to respond to any of those or even Karen's question in the chat.
It's interesting that the questions overlap, because one of the things we do a lot in bargaining for common good is once you redefine the mission as not just wages and benefits, but for example, in public schools, how you get wraparound services in community schools, that takes you to, well, why don't we have that? It's so logical, because there's not enough money. And so we're doing a lot of work on tax and revenue all over the country. But the key difference, not difference, but the approach we're taking is that you need to name the corporations and the individuals who are not paying tax and who are then leading to why there's not enough revenue. So meaning specifically, if you make it, why isn't the government funding this? You fall into a trap. Well, because then you're competing with, well, it should go to the library, it should go to sanitation. We say there's plenty of money. The wrong people have it. And I think there's a nervousness in the movement sometimes naming names. In Chicago, there's a guy, Ken Griffin. He makes his money in high-speed trading. He spends hundreds of millions of dollars to undercut politically what we're trying to do. So I think the question of tax and revenue and naming the names, when the LA teachers went on strikes, they did sit-ins at billionaires. They said that's why there's not money. So I think those things are totally interrelated, and it's a big piece of how we think about tax revenue and naming the corporations. And it's why I think we need a common analysis. Let me just stop there and let other people talk. Let me just address those and hand it off to whoever else wants to.
I know Lauren was chomping at the bit, and I'm sure a couple of others. So Lauren, you're up next.
Yeah, I think it's following a similar vein on what Stephen's saying. I mean, I think this is a work that my own organization, several others, United for Respect, Rails Workers Resource Center, Align, Maritza's on the call. I'm going to mess up and miss people, but a lot of us and a lot of folks working on a number of issues. Some folks focused on workplace organizing and workplace justice. Other folks focused on issues around racial justice, specifically surveillance and technology and policing on Muslim and Black and Brown communities. And what has been worked on through both doing a campaign around how TOT, and this is time on task, Amazon system of tracking, how long are actually working or stopping to do other, normal human functions of life, is also tied to sort of its Ring doorbell technology, which is which is the panopticon in many gentrifying Black and Brown neighborhoods, tied to police departments all over the country, and Amazon's own connection to repressive systems in the West Bank and Gaza and surveillance of Palestinian communities, and trying to tie this link of saying that the technology is being deployed to exploit people in different ways. So I think that's one iteration of how you think about tying and bringing these issues to a front of saying, of course, they're going to spread it they figured out one way to sort of track and tag us in one place. It's going to be deployed in a number of other places and trotted out as a way for power to be maintained. And I also think on this question around tax justice, I think that's been core to a lot of the fights that have been going on with mega corporations from get-go. And I think I think Stephen's right. It is a layup that every trade unionist movement organizer should be taking when going up against a corporation in a fight. We should be talking about not only how they're depleting folks in the workplace, but how they're depleting the communities in which folks are living.
And who's benefiting? Like very
Exactly.
clearly, who's benefiting?
Amen.
Who else wants to jump in? I think
I'll
Joe just came
respond.
off.
Yeah.
Joe, and then Angela, I see you. So I'll have you go next.
Real quickly to Mark's question, where he's asking about unions, whether they practice democracy, and talking about industrial democracy. I think one of the really important things that happens when we talk about bringing labor and democracy close to each other and tying them together is that it's good both for the democracy movement because it makes workers present in it, but it's also good for labor because it makes democracy an issue within labor, which is good for labor. Back in the years when the term industrial democracy was first popularized, that's in that World War I period, and some of the critics of, AFL exclusionary unionism there in that time used this concept to say, I'm not just fighting the czar who's my boss, but also Czar Samuel Gompers, who is enforcing an exclusionary kind of union model on me. To do bargaining for the common good well, I think requires a kind of model of unionism, which is good for unions, because you can't do this kind of deep work between community and union well unless you have a participatory model of a union. A leader in that has been the Chicago teachers. They just went through a leadership election, and Stacey Davis Gates, who's been a great leader of bargaining for the common good, won that election against a slate that defined itself as members first, because their argument is, why are we caring so much about homelessness, about tax injustice in Chicago? Let's focus on what we need as members. And you don't win an election against that kind of challenge unless you've educated your members and helped them feel that they own this. And there's a reason why we need to be hand in hand with the community. And so when we bring labor and democracy together and we say that the labor movement has to be a democracy movement, and the democracy movement has to be a labor struggle too, it's healthy for labor.
Thanks, Joe. Angela, and then I want to see if Mark wants to get back in, and then we'll do our final speed round before we come to a close.
I just wanted to comment on the tax question, just another comment about the way in which unions help to counterbalance, corporate interest and advance the broader interest of working people, and that includes a fairer tax policy. So that was my only point.
Mark, and I want to make sure Sarita got in on any of these questions too. Mark? Mark, you're on mute. We want to hear what you have to
Yeah,
say.
this
There
this discussion has been wonderful. It gets me to think about the transportation strikes going on across Europe, and the vision of some of the aviation unions that combines industrial democracy, democracy in the community, and common good issues. There's a, we're coming out of the pandemic. The aviation sector has to be completely reimagined. The industry, the corporations, of course, have a vision that you could guess. And, the unions are developing this industrial democracy vision of sectoral bargaining at the airport, bringing together all the workers of all the hundreds of employers at each airport to bargain either with the companies as a group or with the airport authority. But a sectoral union that reaches out to the neighboring community on issues of the environment and to the local democracy to enhance democratic control of the airport. Most airports are now dominated by the airlines, even if theoretically they are controlled by the democratic sovereign. And so it's just fascinating. Each airport is different based on its culture, its domestic labor law and unions structure and strategy. And, amazing things happening in the Toronto airport, shop floor leaders reaching across unions to informally create a workers' council that's sector-wide. In Copenhagen, 60% of the workers are unionized, and so the sectoral bargaining is the industrial democracy model. And responding to Mark's question, is more formalized around the unions. There's the sectoral idea, the industrial democracy ideal, I don't think is at all, this goes back to Joe's point, is at all in tension with a bargaining for the common good model. There's a mutual reinforcement, a synergy.
Thank you, Mark. Sarita, and then we'll do our speed round.
That sounds great. Just looking at some of the questions in the chat, and even my own question I had put out there that we didn't really get into tons about, but just to say that, all of this speaks to, I think, this cultural moment we're like I was referencing earlier, and the whole framework of this chapter is really recognizing that at the end of the day, we have to have an expanded definition and notion of what bargaining is and bargaining power is. And that's the power. And that's what's so beautiful about bargaining for the common good and all the ways that Stephen has described it. But just to put the fine point on, like, this idea that people can collectively join together and negotiate with any entity that has decision-making over their lives on a range of issues, from housing issues to workplace to more, is really important. And that in itself will seed new formations and new kinds of ways that people are coming together. And I think the organizer in me gets really excited about that, like what that could look like. And so to Maritza's question about independent unions versus current unions that may exist, I think it's great that we're seeing the growth of these new sort of formations. And I think the pragmatist in me is like, oh my God, how do we support the kind of institution building that requires to ensure that workers not only win, but actually can sustain the power and actually withstand the kind of sort of resistance that they will get from corporate power and political power, for that matter, political politicians and policymakers. So I think there's still a lot to get figured out, but that's also what's exciting about the moment we're in, is that there isn't, and I love what Joe said as our historian here, like no one anticipated the kind of upsurge in the 30s. Like no one anticipated, I didn't anticipate today, even a year ago or 2 years ago, but here we are, a crisis has hit. There's so much that's getting built at a grassroots level or in local communities. And I think the responsibility for all of us is to support and figure out the best way to harness as much of that as we can, and connect and network people to learn from each other. And I think the question in the chat that someone asked, Sienna asked about, how do you direct people who want to be involved? I think that speaks to the need for us to figure out what are the different and new pathways or existing pathways that can be repurposed in this moment for training like OI, BCG is doing trainings. A lot of different groups are doing trainings, and there's hotlines getting set up for workers who are trying to figure out in their workplace whether they should organize. And I think hopefully, maybe Joe, I wonder after this if we can send along with the recording, but just some resources like that can direct people in this moment. But I think we have to pay attention to that and seed the curiosity and the energy that people have right now, which does require us to be willing to let go of what we may already know and kind of help build sort of the new infrastructures to support the kind of organizing that we see today. So I'm hopeful about what's possible, but it's going to require all of us doing it. We can't keep looking to someone else to give it to us. We actually have to build it ourselves.
Thanks for that, Sarita. Okay, so I'm going to actually pick up what you just said. You said you're hopeful about something, and I actually want to do a speed round, 30 seconds or less. I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'm going to come to you first, Stephen, then Lauren, then Sarita, then Mark, then Angela, then toss it to Joe. And here's the question. Leave us with some hope, and maybe I can spark your thinking quickly. I've been thinking a lot about Mariame Kaba's quote, "Hope is a discipline," because I think it actually takes being disciplined in this moment. But I'm a Chicagoan too. And so I also think a lot about Studs Terkel, the great Chicagoan, wrote a book called Hope Dies Last. And then of course, the adopted Chicagoan Jesse Jackson has always reminded us to keep hope alive. So give us some hope as we are closing out this conversation as fast as you can, of course. So Stephen, then Lauren, then Sarita, then Mark, then Angela, and then we'll toss it to Joe to close us out.
30 seconds. Well, one, I'm biochemically an optimist, so I just have to admit that. But this conversation is what gives me hope, that so many of us are seeing the same thing, that there's a moment in time here. And I guess the thing I'd add is I'm hopeful because of all the things we're discussing, but I think there's an urgency that much of the labor movement lacks right now. So my hope is held back by whether we can rise to this moment. And I think that's all of our job, because I think there's a short window here. We won't go through it all, recession, all of that. There's a window to do something amazing. And it's our job to propagate, to organize, to make that happen. And as an organizer, I want to point to the note where we are doing all days, a 12-3 session, East Coast tomorrow, more detail on bargaining for common good. So it will make me hopeful if you all get on that and get some more detail on what we're trying to do. But I just want to thank you all. This has been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you, Stephen. Lauren, and then Sarita.
Yes, hope is a discipline, and that is about continuing to wake up every day and do the work. I do feel very strong hope. I feel very strong sense of hope. People are angry, and not just angry by themselves, but looking for ways to connect and channel that anger into actual change. And I think the thing that we should all be hopeful about as well is that we're in a moment that many of us are accepting that the things that we did in the past may have prepared us with some tools and some understanding of things, but we're freeing ourselves to say, we don't totally have it all figured out, but we're gonna make the road as we walk it.
Terrific. I guess my turn to jump in on hope. Hope is a discipline. If you asked me this question a few months ago, and I say it's still true today, I'm hopeful that many years ago, I helped start Caring Across Generations and talked about care issues and the care economy. And people looked at me like I was insane to suggest that that could be a real thing. And the fact that here we are today and people are talking about care, talking about the care economy, and that matters because they also include workers in that discussion and dialogue. And it's proof of concept for me how powerful narrative can shift if we really do take a values-based intersectional approach to the organizing that we're doing. We can really shift hearts and minds and gather people and have people be fueled by love of the common good, love of one another, and a desire for a better society. And that's what I think we're seeing. Like all the organizing we're seeing, it is about people being frustrated and angry and et cetera. And it is about people demanding a really different future. And that's what fuels me every single day.
Thanks, Sarita. Mark, and then Angela.
Well, hope in a time of a lot of threat and a lot of fear, to me, it turns on continuous exercise of imagination, creativity, vision, and visionary thinking, and doing it together. And that's why, for me, this has been very exhilarating and pulled me out of a swamp of depression after last week's Supreme Court decisions. So I thank all of you.
Thank you, Mark. Angela.
I'm hopeful at the very high support for unions that was referenced. It's at 68%, and the amazing inspiration of young people. In my classes at the university and in my clinic working for unions, they're really an inspiration. I feel like we are at a different time. And so despite all of the challenges, I have some hope because of young people today.
Thanks so much to our co-panelists for a very hopeful and stimulating conversation. And Professor McCartin is going to close us out with his own notes of hopefulness and anything else he wants to say about tomorrow in particular.
Okay, Dorian, thank you so much. Well, as Stephen said, this conversation makes me very, very hopeful. History makes me hopeful. One of the great historians that I admire is Eric Hobsbawm, and he once wrote an essay where he tried to explain this thing we referred to of how unexpected labor breakthroughs tend to be in history. Labor's progress was never a gradual slope, he said. It happened in explosive, discontinuous moments. And when he dug into those, what he found was that, as he put it, these usually are associated with, quote, new types of leadership, organization, or demands, which themselves are doubtless the product of a period of change with which the explosions are attempting to come to terms. And I think that's exactly what we're witnessing now. New forms of leadership, organization, demands, we've been talking about those in this moment. And I'm hopeful that this will be a moment like the ones Hobsbawm talked about. Knowing that, as Stephen said, so many of us are looking at things the same way increases my feeling of hope in that. And Dorian, I want to thank you for your leadership of this discussion. As you all note, folks, tomorrow we're having a gathering to talk about bargaining for the common good in the private sector. Please do register if you'd like to join us. We're going to have this recording available. We'll also make resources available to anybody who contacts us. Thank you, Dorian. Thank you, panelists and colleagues and co-writers and editors, for all you've done here to help advance this discussion. And thanks all for joining us tonight. Good night.